quite often when we talk about revolution, there'll be kind of this refrain in Canada, like, that's something that doesn't happen here. But 1983 in British Columbia was pregnant with revolutionary potential. When you read anything about it from any participants or any history of it, it's just filled with anecdotes, quotes from people about the situation. And it was like a revolution was being born. And that is precisely what was happening. This was a mass movement that brought British Columbia to the verge, right to the edge of a general strike. The RCMP were publishing internal reports about how they thought the unions were infiltrated by communists because they couldn't possibly understand how this was happening. And I believe this is the third most important working class uprising in the country, in the history of Canada. I'll let you guess the other two. And yes, while it ultimately went down in defeat, quite a tragic defeat, as we'll get into, the situation that led to Operation Solidarity bears a very striking resemblance to the one we face today in Canada economically. Having a movement along the lines of this movement is possible, is actually even likely in the future. So it's important we study these lessons. So yes, what was that context? Well, the context of the movement Operation Solidarity was the end of the post-war boom, basically. The post-war boom was this unprecedented economic boom that occurred in the Western capitalist countries, which had basically provided the basis for the creation of the welfare state, the things that make life semi-bearable for working-class Canadians. And this was basically the end of that era. Beginning in 1973. With a massive economic crisis. From 1973 to 1981, you had mass inflation, which we have come to know, and prices doubled in those 8 years. And then on top of it, in 1981, you had the worst recession since the 1930s hit. Unemployment rose to 13.1%. It's at about almost 7 right now. So just think of much worse than that. And it was actually worse in British Columbia, which is a economy heavily reliant on resource development. So you had massive closures of lumber mills, things like this, that were just closing, and unemployment skyrocketed. And the government lost a whole bunch of royalties they had on resource development and was plunged into a fiscal crisis. Not unlike you have today, for different reasons, but yes, the government also was massively indebted. So yes, this was the state of capitalism at the time. Capitalism could no longer afford the post-war reforms that had been granted to the working class. And there was debates in society that were occurring. Many of you may know the Fraser Institute. It is the classic libertarian right-wing think tank in Canada. It was actually founded in the early mid-70s, around this time. And there was this movement globally of sections of the capitalist class that wanted to abandon the Keynesian methods that had been adopted in the post-war period and embark on a more brutal policy. This was spearheaded internationally by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, and they proposed what's known as monetarism, which is, it's not exactly purely free market economics, because they do end up believing in bailing out capitalists. So it's basically socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor in a most brutal fashion. The representative of this trend in British Columbia was the Premier, Social Credit Premier, which Social Credit is basically a conservative party representing rich people, Bill Bennett. So yes, on July 7th, 1983, which became known as Black Thursday, the government tabled a budget of 26 bills. This was an outstanding package. It spared no one. the main frontal attack of this package. It was basically an attack just to offload the cost of the crisis on the backs of the working class. You quite often talk about this theoretically. This is what was happening in practice. And we will see things similar to this, maybe not as brutal, but maybe, you never know. The situation is getting quite dire. So yes, this set of bills proposed to reduce the size of the public service by 15%, slashing over 10,000 jobs, reducing it from 46,800 to 35,400 by 1985. There was a series of anti-union bills. They stripped the trade unions of their right to negotiate anything other than wages. They limited the public sector wage increases, and the government could now, under these bills, could fire any of the 220,000 public sector employees without cause. You could just be dismissed, basically crushing the unions, right? But the importance of this packet of bills is it didn't just target the unions. You had a whole slew of bills that attacked pretty much everyone. They eliminated the Rentalman's Office, scrapped rent control. They abolished the Human Rights Commission, and they fired everyone that worked for the department. They allowed doctors to charge their patients directly for services. This was a gateway to privatization. Access to legal aid was cut. Support for disabled people was cut. Domestic violence shelters were shut down, were cut. In the words of John Fryer, who was the president of the National Union of Provincial Government Employees, he said, "It's not just the trade unionists. It's the women, it's the poor, it's the elderly, it's the sick, it's the minorities. Nobody that is in a disadvantaged position in our society has been missed by this government attack." And just to make everyone know that they were serious, the government immediately gave a layoff notice to 1,600 employees. Stan Persky, who was a journalist at the time, and he became the editor of the Solidarity Times paper, he explained that this was not just some random scheme coming out of Bennett's head. He said Bennett was carrying out the program of a very powerful group of organizations in British Columbia. There's no mystery about who these organizations are. They are the BC Employers Council. They are the BC Chamber of Commerce. They are the Federation of Independent Businessmen. They are the Vancouver Stock Exchange, the Board of Trade, and the list goes on, including landlords associations, associations of automobile dealers, every two-bit contractor who doesn't want a union worker on the job. That's an organized force in society. So this gives you an idea of what was being proposed and who is behind it. So this is an assault by the entire bourgeoisie, let's just put it that way. So the tabling of these bills, they were being debated over a few months. So they didn't all get implemented right away, but just the tabling of them provoked a massive upheaval. Working class people understood this correctly as a full frontal attack. And there was immediate mobilization. There were all manner of groups, political groups, being formed and sprung into action. The BC Federation of Labour, which represents the trade unions in the province, launched what they called Operation Solidarity, which the movement obviously takes its name from, to rally the labour movement. This represented 400,000 workers. At the head of this was BC Fed President Art Kuby, Cliff Anstine, who was the chief negotiator for the BCGEU, that's government employees, and Jack Monroe, the president of the Canadian chapter of the International Woodworkers of America, which is a very significant private sector union in British Columbia. I mentioned these three people. There were more, but these were probably the most three significant union leaders. They became very consequential. We'll come back to it later. But this movement was not, as I said, because the attacks were so broad, the movement was not limited to the trade unions. You had all manner of different groups. You had groups like Women Against the Budget was very significant. You had Chinese Canadians for the Restoration of Human Rights. There was a long list of groups. I could go on forever. There were even members. It was so wide and so broad and so brutal that even members of the clergy were on the side of the movement. One of the main representatives was a priest, actually. There was, and in order to kind of create a broad tent representing all of these groups that were affected. You had the Solidarity Coalition that was founded with delegates from around 200 members representing close to 1 million people to mobilize against the government budget. So this happens all within the first few weeks of the budget being tabled. So society is in a state of ferment and people are fighting back. And it reached quite a high level of mobilization. Give you an example. There's this facility, or was this facility, called the Tranquil Center for Handicapped in Kelowna, for the handicapped in Kelowna, which was scheduled to be shut down by the government. The workers occupied Tranquil. You can read it online. The BC Labour Heritage Centre writes, a hand-painted union flag was raised, locks were changed, managers evicted, and workers took control of the facility. All services were maintained, including a fire department and maintenance. Workers elected a council with representatives from each shift who made decisions democratically. That's a pretty high level of working class consciousness, and that's at the very beginning of the movement. There were big protests. On July 19th, just a couple days after the bills were tabled, 6,000 people gathered in Victoria at Memorial Arena. On July 23rd, more than 30,000 rallied at BC Place in Vancouver. On July 27th, 25,000 people protested on the lawns of the legislature in Victoria, which is extremely significant at the time because it was not the biggest city. It's kind of like the Ottawa of British Columbia, just to put it in context for you Ontarians. Protests drew out hundreds and thousands of people at cities all over. It wasn't just in the two big cities. Quite often, movements are like that. It was every little town had hundreds of trade unionists and people demonstrating, blocking the roads, blocking ferries, etc. There was a huge, obviously the point is here, there was a huge state of ferment and there was a big momentum building up. And this built up to August 10th, where 50,000 people packed into the Empire Stadium in Vancouver. Public sector workers staged a wildcat strike, walked off the job. It was a very militant mood. You can watch some videos online of the speeches, and there was kind of a undeniable momentum at the time. That was the largest demonstration in the history of British Columbia at the time. So look, everything seems like the movement has wind in its sails, right? It's moving in the right direction. People are mobilized. You have this organization representing 1 million people that's mobilizing to fight the government. Seems like we have a really good chance to win. The bills affect everyone. So it's not a narrow struggle. It's not just about public sector wages. It's about almost every single issue you can imagine. So everything's good, right? Well, no. Because it's not enough for people to be angry. It's not enough for people to mobilize. You have to have a plan. And in order to have a plan, you have to have leadership. And there was leadership of a kind. I mentioned 3 of the main leaders. The trade union leaders were the main leaders in control of this movement. But they had spent decades in the bargaining room. They had spent decades. They had not spent decades leading a movement like this. They had no experience leading a movement like this. This was completely out of their experience of things. They were not accustomed to this, and it kind of freaked them out. You can kind of tell when you read about it. They had built their careers negotiating. But what was this? What were they supposed to do? What if they lost control? That's not good, right? We don't like that. So they shifted things to tactics that they were familiar with. The first thing they did was they started a petition. They wanted to petition the government to show the government that lots of people didn't like the budget. They also started an education campaign of workshops to educate the public about why the budget's bad. But in the context, okay, we don't say petitions are always bad, right? We use petitions sometimes. But in this context, a petition and an education campaign are a massive step backwards. People already understood that the thing was bad. That's why they're protesting in the tens of thousands. That's why there's this big coalition fighting against it. So this was a huge de-escalation. They basically stopped mobilizing demonstrations and stuff like this, and they backtracked and went on to this petition and stuff. That happened actually for a couple months where they did this. And because of this, there's a section of the movement tried to, as quite often is the case in mass movements, tries to break through the inertia. and you had a few different actions, mostly organized by smaller groups. The most well-known one, there was a rally held at the Human Resource Minister's house. If anyone here has been to Vancouver, you will know this area called Shaughnessy. It's not a horrible. It's a very rich place. It's if you look at the top neighborhoods in the country, it's 2 of them are in Shaughnessy. It's a neighborhood for the bourgeoisie, basically. It's a very bourgeois neighborhood. So workers came and they protested her house. The media, of course, whipped up a fear campaign about this. This was violating the sanctity of the home, which was entirely ironic for a government who had abolished rent controls and the rentalsman office, right? The leaders of Operation Solidarity capitulated to this wave of hysterical denunciation and fear-mongering. They went on panels on the news saying that these people were not part of Operation Solidarity. And this was just the general mentality of the leaders of the movement at the time. All through the whole thing, you can see it. And they're quite brutally honest about it. At this point, clearly, there's a crisis of leadership. What more could the masses do? They've shown an immense willingness to fight. There's momentum, there's wind in the sails, but the leaders are trying to hold things back. The leaders are trying to prove how reasonable they were. Maybe if we just prove to Bill Bennett how reasonable we are, he'll stop being a big meanie. They don't really understand why Bill Bennett was doing what he was doing. It's not because he's mean, although he does seem like a insufferable prick. It was because he had to do the bidding of the capitalist system, right? At the time, capitalism was in a crisis. They had to do that. But at the same time as the leaders are trying to hold things back, rank and file workers were developing revolutionary conclusions. You can see that extremely clearly. Just as an anecdote. There's a BCTV, which is the state television. You used to have this show, and they would have political leaders on, and they have discussions. They have all 3 union leaders on. It's on YouTube. You can see it. And they have people call in, and this one guy calls in, and he's just a rank-and-file union worker who's been out of work for months because of the economic crisis. And the host asks him, "So you're with my panel this morning?" He says, "Yes." "You're solid with Solidarity?" He says, "Yes. I'd even go for a general strike, and even if it takes more than that." And the host says, confusedly, "You can't have more than a general strike." And the caller said, "Well, you could." So you could see that I don't even know if this guy's read Marxist theory or anything like that, but he's obviously just drawing logical conclusions, you know? But the leaders were fighting this process. They were fighting against this process the entire way. A turning point is the SOCRED convention on October 15th. Initially, the leaders, they were holding their convention in downtown Vancouver. The biggest city in the downtown, in the middle of this big movement, they're holding their party convention. It's almost like a provocation. The leaders resisted. They were like, "We shouldn't protest this. We don't want to go too far. It might get out of hand. It'll get in the way of the petition." That was an idea that they said. But the mood was so overwhelming in favor of protesting the convention. Obviously, anyone with half a brain is like, of course we protest these bastards, right? So they acquiesced, but not without reservation. Art Cuby, the main leader of the BC Fed, said, "Feelings are starting to run so high amongst the rank and file that I'm personally hoping that the planned October 15th Solidarity March doesn't get too large." How about that? You're mobilizing for something that you don't want to get too big at this moment where they're passing legislation that is directly attacking you. So basically what you do, you get the impression of this great historical force of the proletariat of British Columbia moving forward and sweeping the leaders along with it, kicking and screaming. They don't want to do this, but they're forced to. Yes, so this was a big turning point in the development. This rally was a big turning point in the development of the consciousness of the masses. Yes, 50,000 people show up to this, I think it's 70,000 people show up to this demonstration. They march on the SOCRED convention. The SOCREDs, they show how, because they're all like very bourgeois people. like extremely rich types, very disconnected, don't at this point understand the gravity of the situation that's occurring in the working class. Some of the so-called members of the Legislative Assembly inside referred to the demonstration as funny. They were quoted in the press saying that the protesters were, quote, whiners, losers, and communists. You can see their mentality. But yeah, this was a big turning point in the development of the consciousness of the development of the consciousness of the masses. They had tried everything. They've done mass demos. They even did a friggin' occupation of the Tranquil. Next step. In a few weeks, the bills are going to start to be adopted. They're being debated in the parliament. Next step. What's the next step? Don't need to know your theory even. Don't need to know much. General strike, right? Evelyn Farley is a hospital worker that spoke at the rally, argues in favor of a general strike, and basically says, it's the only thing we have left. That was the logical conclusion of the situation. Postal worker Soraya Anju described the mood in this way. She said, in my community and my union, almost everyone was preparing for an extended general strike and a community takeover. These are just some anecdotes to describe what's happening. The words general strike, from everything I can gather, seem to have just spread organically like wildfire through every workplace, every community, every union. A revolution was being born. It's a process. Indeed, and this is a revolution being born. A general strike poses the question of power. Who runs society, the capitalists or the workers? Who makes the economy function? And there was a movement towards a general strike that developed. On October 18th and 19th, the regional Gulf Island Solidarity Coalition and the Lower Mainland Solidarity Coalition, as well as the Vancouver and New Westminster Labour Councils, endorsed a call for a general strike. This is extremely significant. This is some of the main areas, right? The Lower Mainland and Vancouver, that's the bulk of the population right there. October 22nd and 23rd, a delegated solidarity conference discussed resolutions from Prince George, Prince Rupert, and Port Alberni delegates calling for, quote, a general strike until the entire legislative package is withdrawn. The leaders don't want this. They don't want this at the time. This is entirely a welling up from below. Renate Shearer, who's actually the fired Human Rights Commissioner, who's co-chair of the Solidarity Coalition, confirms this, says, no question, people came to that meeting to plan the general strike. And there were plans developed, in spite of the leaders not really wanting to do it. November 1st, the BCGEU workers, the government employees, would go on strike. November 8th, 50,000 teachers and support staff would go on strike. November 10th, Crown Corporation workers would go on strike. November 14th, municipal workers and bus drivers. November 18th, hospital and health employees, and as well, 200,000 private sector workers pledged themselves to take job action in support. On November 1st, this is right around the 1,600 employees are supposed to be laid off right around this time, and the bills are starting to be adopted into law. November 1st, the BCGU strikes begins. Picket lines are rock solid. Everything at this point depends on the teacher strike of November 8th. Now, the teachers' union at this point didn't really even consider itself a union in British Columbia. It had actually decided that it wouldn't be affiliated with the BC Federation of Labour, and they didn't have a tradition of striking. If you think about it, actually teachers at this point were quite largely petty bourgeois. There was an organization inside the teachers' union known as TACT. It's Teachers Against Communist Tactics, and they had directly opposed striking, and they had been quite successful previously. On top of this, the government had threatened to take away the teaching licenses of any striking teacher. In spite of that, November 8th happened, and the picket lines were absolutely solid. 90% of all schools are shut down. This was a shock, I think, to almost everyone. The government was shocked because they thought this is going to fall apart as soon as the teachers don't walk out. But the teachers were solid. I think it was the shock to many people in the movement as well. They were probably waiting for that to fail, and maybe they believed the propaganda. To give you an idea of the mood, Tom Wayman, a teacher at Kwantlen College, said, Our group met every single day and debated whether to stay out or not. There were always people that stood up and said, "This is illegal. We shouldn't do this. This is anarchy." And every day there would be a resounding vote to continue. And then he adds, which I think is important, everything was trembling on the edge of just a major transformation. So you see from all these quotes that it's a bit more than a strike. People can sense something is happening, right? But there was a contradiction. While the workers are moving in this direction and there's this incredible revolutionary mood developing, the leaders are, I don't know how else to describe it, they're breaking down. They are totally uncomfortable with the situation. Art Kuby, the same day of the teacher strike, goes live on TV and breaks down crying. States, "I've always tried to play the role of peacemaker, and now it's come to this." So this is a man who has been accustomed to negotiating, accustomed to class collaboration, being ground down between two armies engaged in battle. That's basically what's happening. Between two great historical forces. And the leadership was not accustomed to this at all, as is obvious. And things were barreling towards a general strike. There's even a RCMP internal memo that basically says, after this, it seems inevitable that there will be a massive escalation of labor action. November 10th, the Crown Corporation workers are set to go on strike. If you know anything about British Columbia, Crown Corporation, very important because it contains, for many reasons, but it contains the ferry workers. A lot of ports, very essential to the economy, would paralyze a large section of the economy if the ferry workers go out. Also contains BC Hydro, right? Shut down the power. Not a wheel turns, not a light bulb shines, not a ferry moves without the kind permission of the working class. So at this point, the government was banking on the teachers folding. They're a day before the ferry workers, the Crown Corporation workers are going to go out. The government, from a position of no, block everything, never agree, never negotiate. We don't care, we're going to ram it through. They panic. Why? Because of the power of the workers. They panic. They realize, oh, shit, we're a minority. The vast majority of everyone could go on strike and then we'd be screwed. So what do? They reach out to the union leaders. They could see in the union leaders that they also want this to stop. We have a common interest. So this is when the question of leadership is absolutely decisive at all times, but especially in a moment like this. As I said, it's not enough to have a mass movement. This is why a lot of people that want to build the movement. We need to build the movement. But we need to build leadership because we need to have the right ideas leading the movement. It's like leading an army in battle. When the enemy starts to weaken and back away, press forward. A good general knows to press forward and you carry the day and you win the battle. But instead, the leaders are like, oh, look, they're weakening slightly. Let's do a deal and make sure no one wins. Or worse, that we guarantee that the other side wins even though they're backing off. So they started government backroom negotiations, trying to put the genie back in the bottle. On November 10th, the leaders announced that the Crown Corporation strike would be delayed a week. They didn't really explain why. Nobody really knows why. Of course, we know why. And Jack Monroe. So Art Kuby has a mental breakdown, and he's removed from his position, and he's replaced by this guy named Mike Kramer, who's a career bureaucrat who had no role in anything. And he descends into the background, and then they send Jack Monroe, the leader of the woodworkers. He flies to Bill Bennett's house in Kelowna and has a discussion with him on the porch and a gentleman's agreement, and they shake hands. And Jack Monroe, agrees to end the strike. The result of this, nothing was signed. No one got to vote on it. It's amazing, right? The government promised Bill Bennett agrees to withdraw the main bill against the unions and allow unions to negotiate exemptions from one of the other ones. But all of the other bills remain in place. This demonstrates the narrow outlook of what is known as business unionism, which is treating a union like a corporation that has clients. You don't have members, you have clients. And you just look at their interests and sell everyone else out. As Art Kuby said himself, I always took the position that you can't negotiate these issues. He's talking about things like human rights, rent, social issues, healthcare, disabled benefits. That's what got us in trouble with the Solidarity Coalition. It's therefore, Jack Monroe had famously said, I can't believe that people wanted a general strike. He said, for causes that I don't damn well agree with. What he's referring to is things like gay rights and minorities. He was a social conservative. So it's therefore the height of irony that these people were leading a movement called Operation Solidarity. And in the process of selling this out, an opportunity of a lifetime was missed. How many times have you heard when unions go on strike, we're too isolated, people don't understand our issues, right? In this one, everyone understands. Everyone's being attacked. It was an opportunity of a lifetime to unite not just the unionized workers, but the entire working class. And they didn't represent their members, actually. Cliff Anstine described this as a no concessions agreement. But the BCGEU got 0% the first year, 3% the second year, and 1% the third year. Inflation's in double digits at this point. This is an insanely bad deal. Yes, and this sellout actually weakens the union in the long run because they're seen to only care about themselves and not about anyone else. It massively weakens the unions in British Columbia. But this is why we say a betrayal is inherent in reformism. The leaders, because they had no alternative to capitalism, actually agreed with austerity. To quote Jack Monroe, I don't think that anyone has said that they're opposed to there being some sort of restraint. The president of the BC Civil Liberties Association at the Empire Stadium big rally, he said, they say they have a mandate, but if I can use my most colorful language, they have a mandate for circumcision, a mandate for circumcision is not a mandate for castration. So you can see they're like, cut, but don't be too bad about it, you know? But this shows the problem with their reformist outlook. But this was a massive, massive betrayal. Bureaucrats in the tops of the unions, the BCGU, you were uncorking champagne bottles, celebrating. They thought this was a huge victory. We forced them back on the one bill, you know. Workers were in tears. People were crying. John Shields, a BCGEU member who had to actually relay the information to different BCGEU locals, he summed it up in this way, he said, it was whatever black day of the week it was. It was a day of mourning for me, certainly, and for the other public sector unions who had felt they had been betrayed. In the place of pickets and demonstrations, there were candlelight vigils. Seriously, there were candlelight vigils. It was as if something had died. And in a sense, something had died. The revolution had been aborted. So yes, this leads on to, this is the main events of Operation Solidarity. But of course, we don't just want to discuss the events. We should discuss why. Why did this happen? So it's easy to shit on the individual leaders. Art Kuby was clearly a coward. Jack Monroe is a social conservative traitor. This is all true. But as Marxists, we must understand these figures not in a vacuum, but as a personification of a historical process. This is actually all too common under capitalism, where the leaders work against, they're trying to contain their members when they're moving in a revolutionary direction. And they end up getting the worst deal. Because the organizations of the working class are not immune from the pressures of capitalist society. This was especially the case in a country like Canada during the post-war period. where they had a social contract between capital and organized labor. The unions during this period thought that the union leaders had this idea that they were slowly winning the unions away from capital, they were slowly winning the state away from capital. They thought, yeah, we'll slowly influence the state. We'll pass this legislation. We'll do this. But really what was happening is, the state is not a neutral body. The state is not a neutral body that can be influenced in that way. The state exists in the final analysis to protect the interests of the capitalist class. And ultimately what the unions were doing is they were fusing the unions with state power and disarming the workers. And this had a huge effect on the leadership of the labor movement. The tops of the unions degenerated because they were predisposed to the pressure of other classes. As Trotsky explained in The Class, the Party, and Leadership, Trotsky explained this whole process in The Class, the Party, and Leadership, with the leadership becoming predisposed to the pressure of other classes and degenerating. Art Cuby, as I said, he's incredibly honest for someone in his position. He said this after the events. He said, "I find it very strange that although I was raised by a single-parent mother in poverty, and I worked from the time I was 13, it wasn't until the development of the Solidarity movement that I realized how far from my own background I had come. Then I realized that the leadership of the trade union movement enjoys middle-class incomes, lives in middle-class houses, in middle-class neighborhoods. And then we started to think this way." He's basically describing Marxist theory of the degeneration of the leaders of the labor movement. He didn't realize that was happening because he's not a Marxist. So this is why instead of leading the workers, the leaders tried to de-escalate. So was this just inevitable then? Right? Because the leaders, they're going to degenerate and then they're going to betray. So why even have a movement? You could draw a pessimistic conclusion that way. So it is clear that Bennett would not have backed down without escalation of labor action. And if you read almost any history of this by labor leaders, capitalist historians, and politicians of all stripes, they'll tell you that, well, you couldn't have had a general strike. That was the logical next step, but that would have been an absolute disaster. So it's good that we didn't do that. Even many so-called Marxist scholars contend that Operation Solidarity couldn't have had a general strike, shouldn't have done that, because that's a revolution. And it couldn't be a revolution because you didn't have good leadership. So you can't do a revolution, right? Even someone like, some of you may have read this book, Brian Palmer, who's a Marxist academic. He wrote probably the best Marxist account of these events. He describes this period as a purely defensive struggle in a non-revolutionary situation. So it appears that even when the workers are at the gates of heaven, they want to storm heaven, they want to have revolution, you still have people telling us, not a revolution. It reminds me of the quote from Rosa Luxemburg where she said, "Before a revolution happens, it is perceived as impossible. After it happens, it is seen as having been inevitable." And it's very easy to look back at a defeat and say it was inevitable. It's very easy to say that no revolution was possible. But this is what is known as fatalism. This is basically ascribing inevitability to historical events. But the outcome of events, as Marxists, we don't believe that the outcome of events is determined in advance. As Marx explained, history does nothing. It possesses no immense wealth. It wages no battles. It is man, real living man, who does all that, who possesses and fights. History is not, as it were, a person apart, using man as a means to achieve its own aims. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing his aims. Yes. So yes, these arguments from many so-called Marxists and historians just justify betrayal. And also, this argument that, well, it couldn't have been a revolution because there was no leadership, is actually proven incorrect. Or we couldn't do it because there was no is proven incorrect by any cursory glance of any mass events of general strikes or whatnot. For example, or that it would be a disaster if you did a general strike. Not true. For example, just 11 years prior to this, you had a insurrectionary general strike of the Quebecois workers in 1972. No revolutionary party of their own. No revolutionary party of their own. Now, ultimately, without a revolutionary party, they were unable to overthrow capitalism. That is true. And I'm not saying that in 1983, BC workers would have toppled the capitalist system inevitably. That's not what I'm saying. But in Quebec, they did succeed in making some very significant gains. And more importantly than just the gains in the moment of what they forced the government to back down on and they won some things, is that because they had fought, the workers were not demoralized. And the revolutionary left in Quebec at that time was ascendant. It's actually similar to the process that we see with Winnipeg 1919 general strike. It's still celebrated, but it was a defeat, right? It was a defeat, but it's still celebrated because people after that, the revolutionary left was on the ascendant, and people learned that you need to build a revolutionary communist party. And that was actually part of the impulse that led to the creation of the Canadian Communist Party. Now, it's impossible to know what would have happened if a general strike had taken place. But what we do know is that this is one of the reasons why you hear nobody talk about this. Nobody celebrates this event except for us. We're the only people that celebrate this event. The left doesn't celebrate the event. The labor movement doesn't celebrate the event. The right sure as hell doesn't celebrate this event. But because this was so depressing, this was the worst way to go down in defeat. Trotsky, when talking about a similar type betrayal if you want to read about a similar type movement, British General Strike in 1926 is very similar. Trotsky says this. He said, "No revolutionist who weighs his words would contend that a victory would have been guaranteed by proceeding along this line, but a victory was possible only along this road. A defeat on this road was a defeat on a road which could later lead to victory." So, when workers get defeated most of the time, but when they get defeated without putting up a fight, that's the most demoralizing defeat. At least when they put up a fight, they have great lessons to learn and traditions to build upon for the next time. For example, everybody knows 1905 was the dress rehearsal of 1917, right? Of course, I'm not saying that every single time it's up and away and always fight. That would certainly not be very good advice to give, because there is a time and place for orderly retreats, right? They're entirely necessary. When it is not a good situation, when you don't have the balance of forces, when you don't advance when you're going to inevitably lose horribly. And a healthy, far-sighted Marxist leadership knows how to retreat when there's an unfavorable situation. But this, as I've described, does this sound like an unfavorable situation? No, the movement was going from strength to strength, and it was precisely at the high point that the thing was sold out. When everyone was waiting, when, everything trembled on the edge of a major social transformation, that they sold it out. And people felt like something had been stolen from them, and it had been. So, yes, outcome was not inevitable. However, what we would argue was the biggest lesson was the need for leadership, right? You can clearly see it, is that you had a situation where the leaders of the movement were working against the members. They were working against the revolutionary process. So this was not inevitable. But the only way to make sure that these things don't happen again, to make sure that these things are not inevitable, is to prepare for a new 1983. And that means build a revolutionary party now, embedded in the youth, embedded in the unions, that can counterpose itself, that can criticize leadership that's doing this, right? Because moments like this don't happen every day. This is one of these rare moments where workers rise up. And revolutionary leadership cannot be created spontaneously. And this is the main leadership, or the main lesson. There were Marxist organizations at the time. The biggest one was the Communist Party of Canada. They had a long history in the province. They had a big presence in municipal politics. They helped create the There was like a left front, still exists today, actually. And they had a membership in the meat cutters, longshoremen, carpenters, joiners, fishermen unions. Actually, one of the main leaders of the movement, George Hewison, was the secretary of the Fishermen's Union, I believe. But this party this is 1983. This is not the party from the 1920s. This party is way different. Decades and decades of Stalinist degeneration had transformed the party. It was called the Communist Party, but it became very adept at capitulating under pressure to the union bureaucrats. It's not even capitulation at this point. They actually had it as a strategy. They said they had kind of like worked out the perfect strategy. And the perfect strategy was, in the words of Hewison, who eventually became the leader of the Communist Party of Canada, he said, you have to unite with the leaders because you can't criticize them and unite with them. And he was asked, how much thought do you give to the price you pay for doing that? And he said, you don't. You don't worry about the price. So this led Michael Walker of the Fraser Institute to say, "Commie schmommy. What matters is the ideas people run with, not what they call themselves." I'd have to agree with him, actually. That is entirely correct. These people were not acting like communists. What can we learn from this? Oh, actually, on this, so Art Cuby, in his characteristic honesty, also said the communists were no real power in solidarity. Really the opposite. In these situations, I would use them. That's a pretty big indictment of the Communist Party. One of the biggest betrayals in the history of the working class of Canada, and the union leaders saying he was using you. So what is there to learn from this? Like, how should they have acted? How do we act? Well, genuine communists, we do strive for united action of the working class. We work side by side, union leaders that we don't agree with, yes, but we reserve the right to explain when they're making mistakes. We explain the way forward. We support union leaders when they're taking a step forward, but we criticize them when they're making a step back. As Lenin explained, he said, the role of the communists is to present a patient, systematic, and persistent explanation of the errors of their tactics, an explanation especially adapted to the practical needs of the masses. This very simple approach should have been this, but not that simple to actually enact. In society, in a movement, there's all sorts of pressures, and the general pressure is to bend to the pressure around you. Could be the pressure of the leaders, could be the pressure of your co-workers, or whatever. And a genuine communist will not bend. You should not bend. You don't want to be shrill. You don't want to be denouncing the leaders in a way that no one can understand. But you don't want to just be silent and say, we need unity. You hear that a lot. Unity, movement, unity. This is where this led you. This was the general leading conception, is that we can't criticize the leaders. We must unite. That is what allowed them to betray so badly. So as Trotsky explained, he said, he's talking about the 1926 British general strike. He said, temporary agreements may be made with reformists whenever they take a step forward, but to maintain a block with them, frightened by the development of a movement, they commit treason. When frightened by the development of movement, they commit treason, is equivalent to criminal toleration of traitors and veiling of a betrayal. The Communist Party, after this betrayal, called this a limited victory. This is basically just left cover for betrayal. And actually, they probably did it because they thought that would help them gain some support somewhere. But this contributed to their demise, actually. Because why would you support the Communist Party at this point? What's the point? They don't stand out. They don't mean anything. As Cuby, who is very honest again, explained, he said, the left, more left than left, took a beating too, because today, just look at the left. Just about non-existent. Right now, you go to a Fed convention, I don't think there are more than 3 or 4 people who really represent the Communist Party. So yeah, that's the price you pay for that sort of policy. So what was possible for a small group of Marxists at the time? The Communist Party wasn't that big. So conditions were such, I believe conditions were such at the time, 1983, that a small group of Marxists pursuing the correct policy, a Leninist policy, could have grown extremely quickly. As Trotsky explained, during a revolution, when events move swiftly, a weak party can quickly grow into a mighty one, provided it lucidly understands the course of the revolution and possesses staunch cadres that do not become intoxicated with phrases and are not terrorized by persecution. Now, unfortunately, this does not seem to be the type of people that were in the Communist Party at the time. But yeah, if you have a strong Marxist cadre organization that don't bend, but hold firm, right? You can grow extremely quickly because in that moment, everyone is looking for explanation. Now, this may not have changed the ultimate course of events. It might have still been betrayed. But what could have happened is the Communist Party could have came out massively strengthened and could have helped a big, wide layer of the most advanced militant workers to understand why this had happened and to prepare for the future. Instead, there was a defeat, it was completely demoralizing, and no one understood why it happened. So this is what Trotsky meant by preserving the possibility for victory down the road. And this, they could have come out as a significant force. So yes, today, like I said, the conditions that led to 1983, to Operation Solidarity, are very similar to the ones that we're going through today. And we will see similar movements. You can see what's happening now. The economy's in the toilet. You have Trump threatening to basically, he's going to exact some sort of concessions out of the Canadian government. So he wants to basically make America first, right? Brings Canada down, brings Mexico down, brings Panama Canal down, takes over Greenland. But yes, you have, in this situation, revolutions are implicit in the situation at one point or another. Mass movements are implicit. General strikes are implicit. And you have them in many countries around the world. We've seen Sri Lanka, Kenya, Bangladesh. Masses are rising up. All of the factors are there. But based on what we've just studied about 1983, what is the most important thing for us to do if we know that something like this is coming? You don't want to be in a situation with this mass upheaval and you're not prepared for it. Let's prepare for a new 1983, for a new Operation Solidarity, for a mass movement, a general strike, a revolution in Canada.